Keith sat under the shade of the lone mesquite tree in the alley parkway, stomach grumbling, body aching, and exhaustion pressing heavily on his eyes. He couldn't sleep, though. Not here. It wasn't safe. He wasn't really sure where safe was anymore, but it definitely wasn't out in the open like this where anyone could find him, be they good or ill-intentioned, and even the good-intentioned ones would bring him to the police, and they'd bring him back to the agency, and he'd go back to the home, and he wouldn't go back. But he couldn't leave the spot yet either, as it was in view of the only dumpster in this town, Garrison City. The sign had read as he stumbled his way down the road that morning into it, with not a single passing car stopping to ask if he needed help, even if he just refute them anyway. That didn't seem to be locked, and Keith desperately needed to eat. And even though he was already fairly sunburned at this point, Keith felt his cheeks heating at the thought that he was resorting to dumpster diving. But he didn't have any other choice. He had no money to buy food, and going on 2 days now with nothing, and the hot Arizona heat baking into him, and all of the walking, he couldn't go much further. He didn't have anything, really, except the clothes on his back, a hand-me-down t-shirt that was too large, a red hooded jacket that was also too big, but he didn't mind that so much as when he drew the hood up it felt like he was hiding, and he wished he could hide him from the world. Decently conditioned jeans, and luckily a pair of sneakers that actually fit. That was it. He'd had a water bottle he'd taken from the family's fridge, a couple of bags of chips, and an apple he'd grabbed off the counter, but those were long gone as of 2 days ago, and his body was forcibly reminding him of such. He wondered if they would report him for taking those things as theft. He pressed his head against his raised knees. Probably. Anything to get more money from the agency, and he would go and it would just be marked down as a runaway, another checkbox on his record, another reason to call him a hopeless delinquent, and put him with another family who specialized in rehabilitating such children. If rehabilitating meant beating him, starving him, and locking him in the closet, they called his bedroom when they weren't making him do chores because hard work would keep him with a boot or a belt as an incentive to keep doing so. They hadn't even been the worst, far, far from it. But they were the first ones to have an adult son living with them, whose sharp gaze had looked him up and is down, and who had looked him up and down, and made Keith's skin prickle, and whose touches he grabbed Keith about his arms had not been cruel, but something far more dangerous, and he'd known he had to get out before something far worse than a beating happened. He survived a lot in his just barely turned 15 years, ever since he'd entered the system at 10 years old, and maybe that's why he'd made such a target, as no matter what they did, what they said, he never stopped fighting back, because Pop had always said to stand up for what was right, and they were wrong, but no one would ever listen to him, and they just hurt him more when he tried and marked him down as violent, even though he wasn't. He was just trying to defend himself. But what he thought that man had wanted. A shiver in contrast to the heat, even in the shade, well over 90, went down his spine, and Keith hunched more over his knees. Had leaving like this been reckless? Yes, Keith would admit that. Could he possibly die? Yes, that too. But he didn't regret it. He'd rather die out here another statistic of a failed foster kid than go back. That said, he really didn't know what he was supposed to do now. His first plan had been to put as much distance between the foster family and himself, and he'd done that, at least, by his count of the mile markers approaching 90 miles, all the way from the last foster family home out by Tucson, and arrived in this fairly affluent-looking town with its sprawled parks and huge shopping centers and well-kept homes and gated subdivisions he hadn't even given a second glance to, and it gave him hope that he could hide here, this far away the agency wouldn't pursue, because why would they want a troublesome kid like him back anyway? And while he still didn't really know what else to do or where to go, he knew that right now he very, very much needed to eat and get something to drink. And this single unlocked dumpster behind the coffee shop was his best chance. and the fact that every other dumpster he'd found was locked made something curdle in his stomach that he wasn't the only one who had gone this route for such measures to be taken. He just had to wait for some employee to bring out a bag of garbage and see what he could scrounge from it. And given that, based on where the sun was and that the steady stream of cars had dwindled, it had to be the start of early afternoon, which is when Keith imagined a coffee shop's rush was over and cleanup began. And he perked up the back employee entrance of the shop that was opening. It revealed a bespectacled young man, a brown apron, bearing a bright orange logo that matched the one on the front of the shop, the Orange Grind, that strangely had the picture of a bright orange mustache beneath the text, pushing an overflowing garbage can. Keith shrunk back against the trunk, but the employee took no notice of him, hefting the bags up into the dumpster, pulling the lid down, and Keith's breath caught. There was a lock on the dumpster lid, but the employee didn't so much as glance at it, whistling and wheeling the now empty garbage can out, back across the parking lot, and into the store. Keith didn't move. He counted out 20 minutes, even as his stomach grumbled and his throat cried, but caution had to win here, as he literally couldn't afford to squander this chance. No one else came out. And heart pounding in his ears, Keith quickly made his way across the back employee parking lot, ducking behind the wooden fence that hid the dumpster from view. He waited another 2 minutes. Still, no one. He stepped up to the dumpster and pushed open the lid. Bags of garbage stared back at him. Keith swallowed, leaned over nearly halfway in, and dragged the nearest one towards him out. The overwhelming smell of coffee grounds met his nose as he opened it. Keith tentatively began to shift some of the garbage around, hoping it was more than just discarded filters. His eyes landed on a cup. It was half full of black coffee, and he could see a few grinds floating at the top. He didn't really like coffee. He definitely didn't want to drink coffee grounds. But coffee was made of water, and Keith very desperately needed water. He pinched his nose shut with one hand and shakily lifted the cup with the other and took a drink. He could still taste it. He made himself drink all of it. And gagging around the taste of it in the grounds, Keith resumed his search. He found a slightly burnt croissant that, after pulling off the burned bits, tasted heavenly. There was another cup of what this time he identified as tea in the bottom, and while it wasn't much, he drank that down too. He was on his third bag of pile-furring. Drinks were definitely harder to come by, but he had a small stash of crusts from partially eaten pastries he'd liberated that he was stacking atop a crumpled napkin, and to take with him. When he heard the back door open, he froze. Someone was coming. There was no way they wouldn't find him, see what he had been doing, that he'd been stealing, even if it was just garbage, just the kitchen scraps. Please, he hadn't eaten in days. He was sorry. Please, let him eat. They never saw it like that. They'd call the cops. They'd take him back to the agency. They'd put him back with that family, and Keith scrambled to his feet, heart roaring, and feeling the last bites of the pastry he'd eaten, threatening to come back up. If he ran out now, he could probably get past, escape into the shopping center, and hide in one of the parks. He dashed for the exit to the dumpster enclosure, and almost ran straight into a man. Not the same one. This one taller, a little broader, and with a bright orange mustache. The owner. Keith faintly realized this had to be the owner, who was carrying a single garbage bag. "Oh," the man said, taking a step back, surprise clear on his features. Keith took the opening. He sprinted past the man, who was shouting something behind him. That might have been a wait, and like hell Keith was going to do that. Jumped the curb and raced across the road. He didn't stop running, even as cars honked, and there were the screeching of brakes, and now other people were yelling. He kept running. It was the only thing he'd ever been good at, but when he was on a leash or a chain, and he flushed one time literally, then it didn't matter how fast he ran. He could only go so far. He ran and ran until staggered footsteps took him to a small park where he collapsed on a bench, chest heaving and hand shaking. No one followed. No one came after him. He was the only one here, alone, as always. The one that no one ever wanted, that the one that never fit in. He didn't belong anywhere. He didn't belong here, but he couldn't run anymore. Keith pulled his legs up onto the bench with him, pulled his hood down over his head to cover his eyes, and curled up on the hard metal, just for a few minutes, just until his hands stopped shaking and his breathing didn't hurt, and he didn't feel like he was about to cry. Keith squeezed his eyes shut against the sting of hot tears. No crying. It didn't help. It just made things worse. Crying always made things worse. So Keith didn't cry, but as he curled up tighter, he wished he could.